Somewhere in a sealed freezer in Beijing, there is a tray of human bones so old that the people they belonged to never saw a written word, never rode a horse, never touched metal. And when scientists cracked open the DNA locked inside those bones and lined it up against the genetic code of a modern Chinese person walking down a street in Xi'an today, something happened that almost never happens anywhere else on Earth. The two matched. Not loosely. Not the way distant cousins match. They matched like a signature matches the hand that wrote it, across a gap of more than 7,000 years. To understand why that single result sent a quiet shockwave through the world of ancient DNA research, you have to understand what scientists usually find when they do this kind of comparison. Because almost everywhere else, the story is one of erasure. Take Britain. Geneticists have pulled DNA from skeletons buried under Stonehenge and in the chalk hills of southern England, people who lived there 9,000 years ago. Then, they compared that ancient code to the DNA of people living in Britain right now. The result was almost brutal in its clarity. Roughly 90% of the ancestry of those original hunter-gatherers was gone, wiped out, not by one invasion, but by wave after wave of newcomers. Farmers from Anatolia around 6,000 years ago, then Bell Beaker migrants from the steppes of Eastern Europe about 4,500 years ago, arriving with wheels, with bronze, and with a genetic signature that simply overwrote what came before. The people living in England today are only a faint echo of the people who first raised the stones at Stonehenge. Now look at the Americas. When European ships arrived after 1492, they didn't just bring flags and diseases. Within a few generations, entire genetic lineages of indigenous nations across the Caribbean and large parts of North and South America were pushed to the edge of existence. Some erased so thoroughly that modern descendants carry only fragments of what their ancestors' DNA once was, buried under centuries of admixture, disease, and displacement. Look at India. A monumental 2019 study analyzing ancient DNA from dozens of skeletons stretching back thousands of years revealed that the population of the Indian subcontinent is essentially a blend of at least 3 separate ancient populations that arrived at wildly different times. Hunter-gatherers already there, farmers moving in from the Iranian plateau around 7,000 years ago, and steppe pastoralists sweeping down from Central Asia roughly 4,000 years ago. What we call Indian DNA today isn't a single continuous thread. It's a rope woven from several different ancient peoples who arrived, mixed, and in some cases nearly replaced what existed before them. Even Egypt, the civilization most people imagine as ancient and unbroken, tells a more complicated story once the genetics are examined. A landmark study published in Nature Communications sequenced DNA from 90 mummies spanning over 1,000 years of ancient Egyptian history. It found that the genetic makeup of Egyptians shifted meaningfully over time, with increasing contributions from populations in the Near East. And in later centuries, sub-Saharan Africa, layering new ancestry on top of old in a slow but steady process of change. The Egypt of the pyramids and the Egypt of Cleopatra were not genetically identical, and neither is fully identical to the Egypt of today. This is the normal pattern of human history. Migration, invasion, conquest, trade, disease, and time itself grind away at ancient genetic signatures until, in most parts of the world, tracing a straight, unbroken line from a Neolithic farmer to a person alive today is like trying to follow one thread through a tapestry that has been unraveled and rewoven a dozen times, which is exactly why what scientists found in China stopped so many of them in their tracks. In 2020, a team led by paleogeneticist Fu Qiaomei at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, one of the most respected ancient DNA laboratories in the world, published a study in the journal Science that would quietly become one of the most important genetic papers ever written about East Asia. Fu's team extracted and sequenced DNA from 26 ancient individuals recovered from archaeological sites, scattered across northern and southern China, some dating back an astonishing 9,500 years. These weren't emperors or nobles. They were ordinary Neolithic farmers, fishers, and early rice and millet cultivators, buried long before anyone in the region had ever conceived of the word China. Then the team did something remarkably simple in concept, but staggeringly difficult in execution. They compared the genomes of these ancient people to the genomes of modern populations living in the exact same regions today, and the results held steady, region after region, site after site. The ancient farmers who lived along the Yellow River in the north 9,000 years ago showed a direct, continuous genetic line to the Han Chinese populations living in northern China right now. The ancient rice farmers along the Yangtze River in the south showed the same continuity with southern Han Chinese and neighboring populations. There was no wholesale replacement, no genetic ghost population erased by a later wave of conquerors. The DNA of people alive today in China traces back, largely unbroken, to farmers who were planting millet and rice while the pyramids of Giza were still 9 centuries away from being built. Let that sink in for a moment, because the scale of it is almost hard to process. 9,500 years is older than writing, older than the wheel in most of the world, older than the domestication of the horse. It predates the earliest cities of Mesopotamia by thousands of years. And across that entire span of time, through ice ages ending, through the rise and fall of dynasties, through wars, famines, floods of the Yellow River that reshaped the land itself, the underlying genetic thread connecting the people of this region never fully snapped. Scientists have a specific term for this. They call it a genetic continuity. And it's one of the rarest things you can find anywhere on the human family tree. Most regions of the world tell a story of layers, of populations stacked on top of each other like sediment, each new arrival partially burying what came before. East Asia, and specifically the core agricultural heartlands of what would become China, tell a story of persistence instead. A story where the people who first tamed the wild grasses of the Yellow and Yangtze River valleys never truly left. Their descendants are still there. So why? Why did this one region of the planet manage to preserve such deep genetic continuity while nearly everywhere else experienced dramatic population turnover? This is where the story stops being just a headline and becomes genuinely fascinating, because the answer lies in a combination of geography, agriculture, and sheer scale that almost nowhere else on Earth replicates. Start with geography. China's core agricultural regions are protected by some of the most formidable natural barriers on the planet. To the west, the Tibetan Plateau rises like a wall, the highest and largest plateau on Earth, brutal and nearly impassable to large-scale migration for most of human history. To the southwest, dense mountain ranges and jungle terrain made large-scale invasion from that direction logistically punishing. To the north, the Gobi Desert and the vast Mongolian steppe created a harsh buffer zone, one that certainly saw contact, trade, and periodic incursions, particularly from nomadic groups, but rarely the kind of overwhelming land-clearing population replacement that swept through Europe when steppe herders migrated west with wheeled wagons and new metallurgy. Compare that to Europe, which is essentially an open peninsula hanging off the western edge of Asia, crisscrossed by rivers and connected by relatively gentle terrain that allowed farming populations, and later horse-mounted steppe migrants, to sweep across the entire continent in successive waves over the course of a few thousand years. Europe's geography practically invites migration. China's geography, particularly around its ancient agricultural core, discourages it. Then there's agriculture itself, and this might be the most underappreciated part of the whole story. Around 9,000 years ago, independently of what was happening in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, people along the Yellow River began cultivating millet, a hardy, drought-resistant grain perfectly suited to the region's climate. At almost the same time, people along the Yangtze River to the south began cultivating rice in wetland paddies that would go on to feed more human beings across history than perhaps any other crop on the planet. These weren't borrowed technologies. They were independent agricultural revolutions, every bit as significant as what was happening in Mesopotamia, and in some respects, they may be even older. Once these populations became agricultural, something crucial happened. Farming supports vastly higher population densities than hunting and gathering. A patch of land that might support a handful of foragers can support dozens of farmers and their families. Once the millet and rice farmers of ancient China reached a certain population density, they became, in a sense, demographically dominant in their own territory. Any smaller group attempting to move into the region wouldn't be invading an empty landscape. They'd be trying to displace an entrenched, numerous, deeply rooted population, already exploiting the land at near maximum efficiency for the technology of the time. It's far harder to replace a population that large and that well established, and the genetic record shows exactly that. Instead of replacement, later arrivals tended to be absorbed, their DNA blending into an already massive genetic reservoir rather than overwhelming it. This pattern of continuity doesn't mean isolation, though, and this is a distinction worth sitting with, because a shallow reading of the headline could easily slide into something inaccurate. The people of ancient and modern China were never sealed off from the rest of humanity in some kind of genetic bubble. Foucault-May's research and subsequent studies have also revealed clear evidence of contact, exchange, and partial admixture over the millennia, with populations from Siberia and the Russian Far East, with groups across Southeast Asia, with peoples along what would become the Silk Road, and further back, with the broader web of ancient human migrations spreading out of Africa and across Asia, beginning around 50 to 60,000 years ago. Modern Chinese populations carry genetic contributions from multiple ancient lineages, including a documented quantifiable relationship to Tian Yuan Man, a roughly 40,000-year-old individual found near Beijing, whose DNA represents one of the oldest modern human genomes ever sequenced in East Asia, and who appears to be a distant relative of populations that would eventually seed ancestry across East Asia, and even into the Americas. What makes the Chinese case remarkable isn't a total absence of outside influence. It's the astonishing degree to which the core, foundational genetic thread, laid down by those millet and rice farmers along two of the world's great rivers, was never overwritten. Other lineages layered onto it over time, the way tributaries feed into a great river without erasing the river itself. The river kept flowing. It just picked up new water along the way. This is precisely the finding that had geneticists comparing China's case against essentially every other ancient civilization on record, because the pattern simply doesn't repeat anywhere else with the same clarity. Mesopotamia, the so-called cradle of civilization between the Tigris and Euphrates, saw wave after wave of Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and later Arab and Ottoman populations move through and over the region, each layer partially reshaping the genetic makeup beneath it. Modern populations in Iraq carry a genetic signature that is a complex composite of all of these historical layers, not a direct, unbroken line back to the very first Sumerian farmers of 6,000 years ago. Ancient Greece tells a similarly layered story. Studies of Bronze Age Aegean populations, including analysis of skeletal remains connected to Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations, show that later migrations, particularly from populations associated with the broader Indo-European expansion, introduced significant new genetic material into the Greek peninsula. Modern Greek populations retain meaningful ancestry from these ancient Aegean civilizations, more so than many parts of Europe. But even here, the story is one of blending across multiple migratory events, rather than a single continuous thread, stretching back to the earliest known farmers of the region. The Indus Valley Civilization, one of the largest and most sophisticated urban cultures of the ancient world, essentially vanished as a distinct genetic and cultural entity, its population dispersing and blending into the later waves of migration that would eventually produce the incredibly complex genetic mosaic of the modern Indian subcontinent described earlier. Mesoamerica offers another striking contrast. The genetic legacy of civilizations like the Maya and the Aztec was profoundly disrupted by the demographic catastrophe following European contact, when disease alone may have killed the majority of the indigenous population within a century, fundamentally altering the genetic landscape of the entire region in a way that has no real equivalent in Chinese history. Against every one of these backdrops, the genetic continuity documented in China's core river valley civilizations stands out as close to unique. Not entirely alone. Researchers have found some comparable, though generally less extensive, cases of long-term regional genetic continuity in parts of the world where geography similarly limited large-scale population replacement, including in isolated pockets of Japan and among certain populations in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. But in terms of scale, the sheer number of people involved and the sheer depth of time being bridged, nothing quite matches what the ancient DNA labs have documented in China. This is a genetic through line connecting hundreds of millions of people alive today to specific, identifiable farming communities that existed nearly 10,000 years before the concept of China as a political or cultural entity even existed. It's worth pausing here to underline something important, something that separates a legitimate scientific finding from the kind of sensational, misleading claims that sometimes circulate around topics like this. This research is not claiming that everyone in China today is genetically identical to everyone else, or that there is some singular, pure, unchanging Chinese DNA that has existed unaltered since the Stone Age. Modern China is home to 56 officially recognized ethnic groups and enormous genetic diversity, shaped by thousands of years of internal migration, regional variation, and yes, external contact and admixture. Northern Han Chinese populations and Southern Han Chinese populations, for example, show measurably different ancestral proportions, reflecting their descent from those two distinct ancient river valley populations along the Yellow and Yangtze rivers respectively, which only began blending together more significantly in the last few thousand years as populations expanded, traded, and intermarried across the region. What the science actually shows is more precise and, honestly, more interesting than a simple headline can capture. It shows that the deep ancestral roots of these populations were never uprooted by the kind of total demographic replacement events that reshaped ancestry almost everywhere else researchers have looked. The thread frayed, gained new strands, thickened and thinned in different places, but it was never cut. This discovery also reshapes how historians and archaeologists think about one of the great mysteries of world history, the origin of the Sino-Tibetan language family, spoken today by more than 4 billion people, making it the second largest language family on Earth after Indo-European. For decades, linguists have debated where and when this language family began. The genetic continuity data lines up remarkably well with newer linguistic models, suggesting the family originated among those very same early millet farmers of the Yellow River Basin roughly 7,000 to 8,000 years ago, spreading outward as agricultural populations expanded, carrying both their genes and their language together in a process researchers now often call demic diffusion. In other words, when those Neolithic farmers' descendants spread across the landscape over thousands of years, they didn't just carry their DNA with them. They likely carried the ancestral roots of the language that would eventually branch into Mandarin, Cantonese, Tibetan, Burmese, and dozens of other languages spoken across Asia today. There's an equally compelling parallel story on the agricultural side. The same rice farming population along the Yangtze River, whose genetic legacy persists so strongly in southern China today, is now believed by many researchers to be connected to the ancestral populations behind the Austronesian expansion, one of the most astonishing human migrations in all of history, in which seafaring peoples eventually settled islands across an almost incomprehensible span of ocean, from Madagascar off the coast of East Africa all the way to Easter Island in the far eastern Pacific, and from Taiwan and the Philippines down through Indonesia to New Zealand. Genetic and archaeological evidence increasingly suggests that this staggering migration, one that predates European oceanic exploration by thousands of years, has deep roots connected to early rice and millet farming populations along the southeastern coast of China and the island of Taiwan. Understanding this puts the original discovery in a much richer context. This isn't simply a story about one country's DNA staying put for a long time as some kind of historical curiosity. It's a story about how a specific ancient population, anchored by two of the most productive river systems on the planet and protected by some of the most imposing natural barriers in the world, became one of the great foundational populations of human history. A population whose genetic and cultural legacy didn't just persist locally, but rippled outward across an enormous portion of the globe, from the mountains of Tibet to the islands of the Pacific to the shores of Madagascar. There's another angle to this story that rarely makes it into the headlines, but deserves real attention because it explains why this particular discovery took so long to surface in the first place. For most of the 20th century, ancient DNA research was almost entirely dominated by European and American laboratories, studying European and Near Eastern remains, simply because that's where the funding, the institutions, and the established archaeological networks were concentrated. East Asia, despite having some of the richest, longest, and best preserved archaeological records on the planet, was comparatively understudied at the genetic level well into the 2010s. It wasn't until Chinese research institutions began building world-class ancient DNA laboratories domestically, combined with a new generation of scientists trained in both the technical rigor of Western paleogenetics and an intimate familiarity with China's own archaeological record, that studies of this scale and precision became possible. In many ways, the discovery of this extraordinary genetic continuity isn't just a story about ancient history. It's a story about the recent rapid rise of Chinese science itself, and about a gap in the global understanding of human ancestry finally beginning to close. It's also worth sitting with just how many separate research efforts had to align before scientists could say this with real confidence, because a single study, however well done, rarely settles a question of this magnitude on its own. After the initial 2020 science paper, additional research teams began examining other regions of China and other time periods, looking for cracks in the pattern. A study focused on the Tibetan Plateau found that even in one of the most extreme, high-altitude environments on Earth, populations there carry ancestry tracing back tens of thousands of years, with clear genetic links to both ancient Yellow River farmers and even older Paleolithic populations, alongside unique adaptations for surviving at extreme elevation that themselves evolved over thousands of years of continuous habitation. Research into southern China and the region historically associated with early rice cultivation found the same pattern of continuity extending south into what is now Fujian and Guangdong province, and further still into Taiwan, reinforcing the connection between ancient Yangtze rice farmers and the broader story of Austronesian expansion described earlier. Even research examining more recent historical periods, including DNA extracted from remains connected to specific dynastic era populations, found consistent genetic through lines connecting people from those historical periods to modern populations in the same regions, adding yet another layer of confirmation stacked on top of the deep Neolithic connection. Taken together, this isn't a single lucky result from one lab. It's an entire body of independently conducted, cross-verified research, built up study by study over roughly a decade, all pointing toward the same conclusion from different angles, using different samples, different statistical methods, and different research teams. That kind of convergence is exactly what scientists look for when trying to distinguish a genuinely robust discovery from a fluke or misinterpretation of limited data. And here, the convergence is about as strong as paleogenetics gets. It's also worth noting how difficult this kind of research actually is, because the sheer scale of scientific effort behind a discovery like this rarely gets the attention it deserves. Extracting usable DNA from bones that are thousands of years old is an extraordinarily delicate process. Ancient DNA degrades over time, breaking into short, damaged fragments, and it's almost always contaminated with DNA from soil bacteria, fungi, and the countless other organisms that have interacted with a burial site over millennia. Researchers working in these labs operate under conditions similar to a hospital's most sterile surgical suites, wearing full protective suits, working in positive pressure clean rooms, specifically designed to prevent modern human DNA, including their own, from contaminating samples that might be the only genetic record left of a person who lived before the invention of the wheel. Fu Qiaomei's laboratory, and others like it around the world, including teams at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, where much of the foundational technique for ancient DNA sequencing was pioneered by researchers like Svante Pääbo, who would go on to win the Nobel Prize in 2022 for his work decoding the genome of Neanderthals, represent some of the most technically demanding and meticulous science being conducted anywhere today. The bones used in the pivotal 2020 China study came from archaeological sites including Boisman in the Russian Far East, the Yellow River Basin sites associated with early Yangshao culture, and sites along the southeastern Chinese coast connected to early rice cultivation, each one carefully excavated, radiocarbon dated, and cross-referenced against dozens of other ancient and modern genomes from populations spanning from Siberia to Southeast Asia. It's the kind of research that takes years, often over a decade, from the initial excavation of a burial site to the final publication of a peer-reviewed paper, involving archaeologists, geneticists, statisticians, and historians, all working in careful coordination. And this is precisely why the finding carries so much scientific weight. It isn't a single throwaway data point or a headline manufactured from a press release. It's the product of a rigorous, cross-disciplinary body of research, published in one of the most respected scientific journals in the world, and subsequently supported by additional independent studies examining different regions, different time periods, and different genetic markers, all converging on the same fundamental conclusion. The people who first planted millet along the Yellow River and rice along the Yangtze River nearly 10,000 years ago are not a vanished, forgotten population lost to history. In a very real, scientifically documented sense, they are still here, walking around today, carried forward in the DNA of thousands of generations of unbroken descent. There's one more thread in this story that tends to catch people off guard the first time they hear it, because it stretches this narrative of continuity across an ocean most people never think to connect to China at all. Ancient DNA research has repeatedly confirmed that the ancestors of indigenous peoples across the Americas trace back to populations that moved through Siberia and across the Bering Land Bridge roughly 15 to 20,000 years ago during the last ice age, when sea levels were low enough to expose a land connection between what is now Russia and Alaska. Those Siberian populations themselves share deep ancestral roots with the same broader northern East Asian genetic lineage that includes the ancient populations of northern China, including individuals like Tianyuan man mentioned earlier. It means that somewhere far back in the genetic history of indigenous peoples from Alaska to Patagonia, there is a shared ancestral connection reaching back through Siberia into the same deep northern East Asian lineage that also gave rise to the ancient farmers of the Yellow River. It's not a claim that Native American populations are somehow from China in any direct sense. That would be a significant distortion of a much more nuanced genetic reality involving many populations across Siberia and Beringia over thousands of years. But it is a real, well-documented example of how far the genetic threads connected to ancient East Asia actually reach, stretching from the river valleys of northern China all the way across the Pacific Rim to the tip of South America, a reminder of just how interconnected the deep human story really is beneath the surface of modern national borders. This is also a good moment to address something that skeptical viewers are right to ask about whenever a headline like this circulates. How do we actually know researchers aren't just cherry-picking data to fit a narrative? The honest answer is that the statistical methods used in these studies are specifically designed to guard against that kind of bias. Researchers use tools like principal component analysis and formal statistical tests, known as F-statistics and admixture graphs, which mathematically model how much of a modern population's genome can be explained by contributions from various ancient source populations. These aren't subjective visual comparisons of skulls or vague cultural assumptions the way early 20th century anthropology sometimes operated. They're quantitative genetic models, built from millions of data points per genome, peer-reviewed by independent experts before publication, and, crucially, replicated by separate research teams using separate samples. When a finding holds up across all of that scrutiny, as this one has, it carries a very different kind of weight than a casual claim about ancestry you might see in an unverified social media post. It's also worth being honest about the limits of what ancient DNA can and can't tell us, because good science is defined as much by what it doesn't claim as by what it does. Genetic continuity in a region tells us about biological ancestry, the literal passing down of DNA from parent to child across thousands of generations. It doesn't, by itself, tell us that culture, language, or identity remained frozen and unchanged across that same span of time. Modern Chinese culture, language, and society are the product of thousands of years of dynamic change, invention, internal migration, and external exchange along trade routes like the Silk Road. Genetic continuity and cultural continuity are related but distinct threads, and responsible science and responsible storytelling about that science keeps them clearly separated rather than blurring biological ancestry with sweeping claims about unchanging civilization or unbroken tradition. What the DNA tells us is specifically and remarkably about the people themselves, the biological descendants of a 9,000-year-old farming population, still living, largely in place, in the same river valleys their ancestors first settled. So when you step back and look at the full picture, what does it actually mean to say that scientists compared Chinese DNA to every other ancient civilization and found only one true match? It doesn't mean some mystical, singular bloodline has survived untouched since the dawn of time. It means something far more grounded, far more rigorously supported by hard science, and honestly, far more remarkable when you really consider it. Out of every major ancient civilization examined through the lens of modern paleogenetics, Egypt with its shifting Near Eastern and African influences, Mesopotamia with its endless procession of conquering empires, the Indus Valley with its genetic dispersal into the broader subcontinent, Bronze Age Greece with its Indo-European overlay, Britain with its near-total population replacement, and the civilizations of the Americas fractured by catastrophic contact-era collapse. The ancient farming populations of the Yellow and Yangtze River valleys stand almost alone in the degree to which their direct genetic descendants remain identifiable, traceable, and demographically dominant in the very same region their ancestors first settled nearly 10 millennia ago. It's a finding that quietly rewrites a piece of the human story, not with sensationalism, but with painstaking, peer-reviewed, thoroughly cross-checked science. It tells us that in a world defined overwhelmingly by migration, conquest, and the slow erasure of what came before, there is at least one place on Earth where an ancient population managed to do something almost nowhere else could survive, largely unbroken, unbeaten, and unreplaced, for nearly 10,000 years, hidden in plain sight in the DNA of over 1 billion people alive today. And that, more than any single headline could ever capture, is the kind of story that reminds us just how much of our deepest human history is still written, quietly and patiently inside our own cells, waiting for the right scientists with the right tools to finally read it.